Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan and today I'm going to be ranking every single NHL team's future from worst to best. Now, over the next 5 years, which teams will have the most and the least success, and how will your team do over the next 5 seasons? Watch till the end for the complete rankings, and of course, hit that subscribe button. 50% of you guys aren't subscribed, so if you like hockey content, this channel is the place to be. Now again, it is super important, but this list is entirely based off the next 5 seasons. So we're going to be going until the 2027 season, trying to determine over these next 5 years who will be the most and least successful teams out there. Now let's start off today's ranking with the team that in my opinion has the worst future in the NHL these next 5 years, and in my opinion the team that will easily be the worst team in the NHL over these next 5 seasons. We're going to go to the Central Division and a team that really just started their rebuild this last offseason with the Chicago Blackhawks. And I think the Blackhawks want to be bad over these next 5 years by design. They might be okay by maybe 2027, but even then you're kind of stretching it a little bit. Obviously they started the rebuild getting a bunch of guys off the roster, and they're likely going to trade Kane this next season. Taves is obviously going to be gone. There's not many guys redeemable, and honestly, I mean, I look at Seth Jones as a core part of the team, and even he might be like 33 years old by the time the Blackhawks are even close to being back in the playoff picture. Now let's move on to number 31, the team with the second worst future in the league, and to me this was also a pretty obvious one. A team that in my opinion has absolutely no direction right now, and that is the Philadelphia Flyers. A team that, another team like Chicago, maybe not as bad, but I think these next 5 years are going to be another rough half decade for Philly. You look at the situation, a lot better of a roster, I guess, than Chicago, but I also feel like the aimlessness is worse in Philly's direction. They need to go in a rebuild, and they just keep trying to brush it off like it doesn't need to happen, but it's obvious that this Flyers team isn't going to be good enough, and I look at the roster, you have some younger players there like Joel Verby who are going to be part of that long run, players like Travis Konechny who could still be there, Ivan Provorov, Travis Sanheim for instance, and maybe Carter Hart. You have core players there, but I also think the direction of this Flyers team is just not where it needs to be, and I think they'll suffer in the next half decade because of it. But now let's move on to number 30, still in the dumps though in terms of these next 5 years, and I think a team that kind of is more along the same lines as Chicago, knowing that they're not going to be all too competitive, in the San Jose Sharks. Now obviously a better roster than Chicago's, but I also think they're going to be in that top 5 of the draft order for a while here. You got players like Timo Meier who hopefully be there for the long haul, but you got a great prospect pool coming up with players like William Eklund, Thomas Borderlo, to name a couple. But to me, I think for the Sharks, even though you do have a good prospect pool, I think there will be a lot of growing pains before the Sharks are once again truly competitive. Speaking of growing pains, let's go on to a lot of pain that is coming to this team in the near future. But again, kind of like Chicago and San Jose, a little bit by design. Next up at number 29, I have the Arizona Coyotes, a team that I could see maybe being okay in 2025, maybe okay in 2024 if everything pans out. But I also feel like for the Coyotes, they know they're going full scorched earth and truly are going to be as patient as possible. I mean, you look at the pick situation for third-round picks in 2024, 4 second-round picks in 2025. They're truly stocking up. But you see in the ages of players, Keller is going to be there for the long haul for sure, Schmaltz as well, possibly Jacob Chychrun, but the Coyotes are putting all the focus in the scouting and development as they should, and rebuilding as they should as well. And again, this is the thing, Arizona's future is looking brighter, but I also, again, you got to take into the next 5 years, they're not going to be a competitive team, so that is why they are so low. But next up, let's go on to number 28, a team that is kind of in the opposite direction of Arizona, a team that will likely be declining over these next couple of years in the New York Islanders. Now, I can see them doing pretty well this next season, possibly even making the playoffs, but I feel like this next year is possibly the last the Islanders really have as a competitive team. You see some of the roster players, I mean, you got Matthew Barzal there as a huge piece, and you got a lot of solid players there, but I think the ages is a big thing. Anders Lee at 32, Josh Bailey at 32, Brock Nelson at 30, Pajot at 29, Paul Mary at 31, and you look at the defense, much younger, which I think is going to be a big part of this roster, and obviously Sorokin is going to be huge for them, but I do have a feeling that for the Islanders, they'll just kind of be in that below average tier for a while, and especially by maybe 2024, 2025, they'll be more in a rebuilding direction. Next up, let's go on to number 27 here, and going back to the Pacific Division, I'm going to move on to number 27 here and go to the Seattle Kraken, a team that I still have many complaints about with how they handle the expansion draft, but it's seeming like they're going in a kind of rebuilding rebuilding direction. I guess it's a weird team to think about. But I think over these next 5 years, they'll be okay. They'll be fine. But I also do feel like with players like Matty Beniers and Shane Wright coming up, that definitely makes their overall future much better. And if it was maybe a 10-year, decade sample size of the future, maybe they'd be a little bit higher. But over these next 5 years, I think they're just going to be okay. But still likely getting a lot of top 10 picks in the meantime. Now, as we go through this list, we have a couple of teams down in the dumps here that will be declining hard, but I mean, I don't think there's many teams out there that will decline as much as number 26. And next up, I'm just gonna go with it. I have the Boston Bruins. To me, they're going to be a team to watch over this next half decade for a multitude of reasons. And to me, you have a couple of players there that will be core players for the future with David Pastrnak, McAvoy as great examples, and Jeremy Swayman in goal. But I don't think that's going to be enough for them to keep competitive with their ages. Again, Brad Marchand at age 34, we're going to start to see him probably decline a little bit, as we kind of saw a little bit this last year. You got Patrice Bergeron, who's older as well. And just a lot of you got Patrice Bergeron at 37, you got Craig Smith at 33, Foligno at 34, Coyle at 30, Hall at 30. A lot of guys that are now past their prime, and I could see them doing solid this next year, but to me, I see them missing the playoffs, and I don't see them making the playoffs for the next 5 years. Might be a hot take, but I think the future for Boston is looking rough. And that prospect pool ain't doing them any favors either. Next up, let's go on to another team that's kind of in a directionless state right now. Another team that, in my opinion, should go full rebuild, 110%. Next up, I have the Winnipeg Jets here coming in at number 25. And to me, the Jets, it's just sad to see because they're a team that has a lot of great talent, but also is held back from systems and just really not prioritizing the things they need to prioritize. And the way the roster has also been built has been very flawed. But you see, they're in a weird situation where they do have great players still, and we'll still have great players in 5 years' time with players like Ehlers, Dubois still playing great. But I also, again, still have massive concerns with that defense, and Connor Hellebuck's best days might be over, even if he still was pretty great this last year. So to me, I think for the Jets, even though they have a solid prospect pool, I still think they'll be in no man's land in these next 5 years, especially if they don't go in a full youthful direction like I think they probably should. Now, let's go on to number 24, okay? Let's go on to a team that I really want to see in 2027 to see how this roster shapes up. Next up at number 24, I'm going to move on to the Vegas Golden Knights. I don't know how to judge this team, personally. They might be good this next year. They might make the playoffs. But even if they do, I mean, you still got Jack Eichel at 25, which is huge for them, but you look at the ages. Mark Stone is 30, Marchessault is 31, Riley Smith is 31, and you look at that defense. Pietrangelo is 32, Martinez is 35, McNabb's 31, and the goaltending. Obviously, Robin Leonard is out for this next year, but he's 31 as well and has had a lot of injury history as well, which is catching up to him. To me, with Vegas, and especially with their cap situation, I think they might be one of the more screwed teams out there, but I also still think the roster is good enough right now to still compete, and that's kind of what holds them back from maybe a bottom 5 spot. Now, going on to another team that I think will be pretty solid over these next couple of years, but by the time 2025, 2026 comes around, I think we'll be more in the lesser side of the NHL. Next up, I have the Washington Capitals here at number 23. A team that, again, this next year I think is going to make the playoffs, going to be a solid team, and maybe even in 2024 could be a solid team too. But I think, again, by the time 2025 hits, we're going to start to see that decline. Obviously, Ovechkin at 37, Kuznetsov at 30, Oshie at 35, which just makes me feel so old. But even players like Mantha will likely be out of their prime by the time that 2025 hits. You look in that defense, Carlson in 2 years' time will be 34. You got Orlov at 31. Just all this roster is so much older. Even Kemper at age 32, even if he probably will age pretty gracefully. But you got Nicholas Backstrom at 34 as well. Just a lot of older talent. And even though I think they'll be playoff contenders these next couple of years, I just have a feeling by the time 2025 rolls around, they'll be down in the dumps. Next up, let's go on to number 22, and a team that, in my opinion, although maybe a little bit directionless, kind of like Winnipeg, I think might be saved by their just true star power in the prospect pool, no pun intended. Next up, I got my favorite team in the Dallas Stars. Now, at number 22, they're an interesting team to place because I think they have maybe one of the better younger groups of the entire NHL coming up, but I also think their cap situation kind of screws them a little bit. You obviously have great players like Jason Robertson, Rupe Hintz, and you've got a lot of great guys coming up like Wyatt Johnston, Logan Stankoven, and Antonio Stranges, and on that defense, you got players like Heiskanen and other players on the prospect pool coming up too, with Thomas Harley hoping to take that next step, and obviously Jake Ottinger at 23 years old is huge to have. But I just look at like the Jamie Benn contracts, the Tyler Seguin contracts, and to me, there's a lot of older talent on the team that is obviously overpaid. But I also have a feeling that by the time maybe 2024 and 2025 happens, if the Stars continue to acclimate that prospect pool, I could see them maybe being one of the more younger teams out there and hopefully still contending at that point. Now let's move on to number 21, and a team that will likely over these next couple of years not be very competitive whatsoever, but by the time 2024 and 2025 hits, they'll start to really show what they're made of. Next up at number 21, I have the Montreal Canadiens. Now, another team that if we're just basing it like pure future, like over the next 20 years, I think has one of the better futures in the NHL, but again, just off these next 5 years from 2023 to 2025, I think the Habs will still do pretty all right. And again, by the time 2027 rolls around, I think this Habs core and roster is going to be so much fun to watch. To me, one issue might be the goaltending. There's not really a clear-cut number one guy for the future at all in the prospect pool. We've got great depth on defense, and obviously players like Suzuki, Caulfield, Slavkovsky, and so many great youthful talent on the forward group. I think will propel them by the time 2026 hits into being a really great team. Now let's go on to the top 20 though, and I guess the top 20 futures in the NHL over these next 5 years. Let's go on to a team that I am kind of conflicted on quite a bit, especially with what they could look like 5 years down the line. Next up, I have the St. Louis Blues. Now, the thing is, I think what propels them still to this spot is how good I think they'll still be over these next couple of seasons, but I also think some of the youthful talent is huge for them, even though by the time 2027 hits, Ryan O'Reilly, Tarasenko, Shen, all these guys will be past their prime. Buchnevich will still be pretty great. You'll have Jordan Kyrou, Thomas in their true primes, and on the defense, even though there is a lot of age there, I think by the time 2027 hits, they won't be all too competitive, but I still think they got quite a few years left in them. But now let's move on to number 19, and a team that over the next 5 years, I think might be actually a little bit underrated. Some people might think I have them too high, but next to number 19, I have the Columbus Blue Jackets. Now, here's the thing. I don't see them making the playoffs this next year, but I also think by the time maybe 2025 hits, Columbus is going to be a sneaky team to watch. I mean, you look at some of their forward group already with Gaudreau, Laine, obviously big parts of it on top of players like Roslovic, but the thing is that prospect pool and the star talent there is amazing, with players like Kent Johnson coming up, Cole Sillinger, Emil Bemstrom will hopefully be a big part of things, as well as Kirill Marchenko coming up too. And you look at that defense, Zach Werenski will still be a part of things, Vladislav Gavrikov will still be in his prime, you got Adam Bogusz coming up, Jake Bean, you got, of course, the players they just drafted, and David Jiricek and Metiachuk on top of things, and Merzlikins will still be relatively young even by the time 2027 hits. So to me, and you got, of course, Tarasov coming up, who could be something special, I think the Blue Jackets have one of the more underrated and depth-filled futures, with every single position looking solid for the future. Now let's go on to another difficult team to process over these next 5 years, but a team that I think will still be competitive throughout the whole next half decade in the Nashville Predators, a team that will have some aging players with, of course, Matt Duchene getting older, Johansson, Granlund, and unfortunately players like Roman Josi, Matthias Ekholm, longtime Preds. But I also do like the mixture of youth that they'll have coming up. I mean, for example, you have Juuse Saros still at age 32 in 5 years' time, and you'll have a Skarov as well as his backup coming in and truly dominating the NHL at that point. But I also love a lot of the youth they have with players like Philip Tomasino, who came up this last year. You'll have Dante Fabro a part of things and hopefully taking bigger next steps. But you've got players like Zachary Leroux coming up on top of things. You've got great players like Afanasayev and Fyodor Svechkov. And to me, there's going to be a lot of great depth on really every single position that will keep them competitive throughout. But now let's go on to a team that I think will miss the playoffs in 2023, but 2024 and onward, I think will be one of the more fun teams to watch in the entire NHL. Let's go on to number 17 here, and next up, I have the Buffalo Sabres, a team that, again, by 2024 and onward, I think will be one of the more fun teams to watch, and even though they have some older contracts on the roster, like Jeff Skinner, for instance, I still think they're a team that has such a great future ahead of them, especially if the goaltending turns around, with players like Eric Portillo as well in the prospect pool. I don't have many doubts there. But you have, of course, that culture turnaround led by Alex Tuch. He'll obviously be named the captain at some point and leading that roster, but the forward talent they have, just Tage Thompson coming up is huge. Of course, Dylan Cousins coming up, Peyton Krebs, Jack Quinn, so many great guys that'll be big parts of that top six. But the defense will also be huge to watch. With Dahlin taking next steps, you're going to have Owen Power becoming one of the best defensemen in the NHL, but also players like Matthias Samuelsson taking next steps. And to me, on Ryan Johnson, you can't forget about him taking those next steps too. And to me, I think the Sabres will be really balanced over these next 5 years and will hopefully start to be a contender for the first time in a long time. Now, let's move on to number 16, a team that has a lot of the great pieces in place, but also I'm not really sure will be a true contender over these next 5 years, even if they might want to, and that is the Vancouver Canucks. Now, I debated having them maybe a little bit lower, maybe a little bit higher, but to me, I think they'll just be pretty league average over these next 5 years when you combine everything. You still have great players, though, that'll be in their primes over these next 5 years, like Pettersson, Horvat, and of course, Quinn Hughes in that defense, and Thatcher Demko. But I also have a feeling that maybe by year 2, we'll start to see JT Miller kind of decline. Same thing kind of already happening with Bo Horvat. And to me, I think the prospect or the lack of prospect depth for the Canucks might hurt them, especially even in a couple years' time. I mean, they have committed themselves to locking themselves with the JT Miller contract into being a true contender. And I still have worries if they'll be even able to make the playoffs this next year, let alone taking those big next steps. But I think Pettersson, Hughes, and Demko will hopefully lead them to some success over the next half decade. Now let's go on to number 15, a team that has a couple of last shots left, and we'll see how successful they end up being. Next up at number 15, I have the Pittsburgh Penguins, a team that absolutely by 2025, 2026, 2027 will likely not be all too great, but I still have a lot of faith that over these next couple of years, they'll still be one of the better teams in the Metro, one of the better teams in the East. Of course, keeping Crosby, keeping Malkin, keeping Letang, and they're obviously now in their mid-30s, but I think especially Crosby will age pretty gracefully. Same thing with Chris Letang, but you still have a lot of older players in that defense, like Petrie, like Dumoulin, like Jan Ruda, and to me, there might be a little bit of a lack of true youth coming up, and that is also a symptom of them just not getting a lot of great talent in the draft recently. And although I think they still have some great pieces, I think they'll have just maybe a couple years left of true playoff contention. Now, there were very few teams out there that were as hard to rank as this 4-team spot, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I'm going to have the Minnesota Wild at this 14th selection, a team that I just have no idea what they're going to be in these next 5 years. I mean, they're probably going to go for it this next season with, of course, the Parise and Suter buyouts affecting their cap situation. But to me, I still have hope that there'll be a competitive roster over these next 5 years with Kaprizov in his prime. But also a lot of that is because of the prospect pool they have coming up with Marco Rossi, with Matthew Boldy, who came up this last year, with Murat Kuzminov. I mean, when we look at the AHL defense, you got Lambos, O'Rourke, Damon Hunt, Kalen Addison, so much good talent there, and Jesper Wallstedt as well, who I think maybe in just a couple of seasons could be completely NHL ready and able to take over that tandem. And to me, I think that youth is really what will propel Minnesota to stay in the race. Next up, let's go on to a team that probably would be much higher if we're taking a look at the next 10 years, but over the next 5 years, I still think will be one of the better teams in the NHL. Next up, I have the Anaheim Ducks, a team that I see just missing the playoffs this next year, but just like Buffalo, I think by the time 2024 rolls around, they'll be much more competitive and a lot more scary as that complete youth takes over the roster. But you see so many great options there: Troy Terry, Trevor Zegras, Mason McTavish, just on the forward group right now, on top of players like Isaac Lundestrom, who have been great NHL players so far, and on that defense, leading the way with players like Jamie Drysdale. But to me, it's just like teams like Buffalo. You have that great prospect pool that I think will definitely take over. You got Pavel Mintyukov, who they got in the last draft, Olin Zellweger, who continues to be a steal from the 2021 draft, but you also got Lucas Dostal, who I think is going to be a great potential starting goaltender for the Ducks in a short while. And to me, I think for Anaheim, you got great depth and great youthful star power in every single position. Now let's move on to number 12, a team that I think will be competitive for sure over these next 5 years, but I still have some big question marks with. Next up, we're going to go to the East and go to the Florida Panthers. Panthers, a team that, I mean, they don't have any first round picks for the next 3 years, so that'll really help the prospect pool for sure. But you still have a lot of youth on the forward group, and to me, this is the biggest strength and biggest potential thing to look for over these next 5 years. Barkov at 27, Tkachuk at 24, Reinhart at 26, Bennett at 26, Verhaeghe at 27, Duclair at 27, Anton Lindell at 20. That is easily, for the next half decade, the biggest strength of this Panthers roster. And of course, Aaron Ekblad at 26, but I think the defense, there's cause for concern. And even though you do have some solid prospects in the pool defensively, nothing that is absolutely amazing and will save what it's looking like. I mean, it looks bad right now, but I think in a few years' time, as that cap situation gets worse and worse for them eventually, as it would, I think that defense is going to go pretty thin. And even though Spencer Knight, I think, will be able to surpass Bobrovsky at some point, he is still going to be older, and that contract is going to be a big factor for the Panthers, likely maybe not even being able to re-sign a couple of guys because of it. We'll see. I think the Panthers will still be great and still be a really interesting playoff contender, but nothing is confirmed for them right now. But now let's move on to the team right outside the top 10, but still a team that over these next 5 years is easily going to be one of the most electrifying and fun teams to watch, and definitely one of the better youthful cores in the NHL. Next up, I have the New Jersey Devils, a team that I think just has so much to love over these next 5 years. You're going to see the prime of Jack Hughes, the prime of Nico Hischier, the prime of Jesper Bratt. You're going to see the prime of players like Dawson Mercer. You're going to have the prime of John Marino, of players like Damon Severson. You're going to have Simone Nemec coming out of the roster. You're going to have Luke Hughes coming out of the roster. You're going to have Alexander Holtz coming out of the roster. So much great talent coming up. My main problem is just the goaltending. I mean, Vanek Vanacek has proved to be decent, but Blackwood is still a big question mark, and there's no guy that I truly see being able to lead them to a Stanley Cup, for instance. Even though most of the roster besides that is great, the goaltending, I think, could hold them back a lot. But now let's enter the top 10 and go on to a team that just barely is above New Jersey for me, and it's a razor-thin margin. Next, I'm going to go to another team, kind of like New Jersey, though, that is hoping to get back in the playoff race soon. Next up, I have the Ottawa Senators, a team that, again, just barely is ahead of New Jersey, but I also feel like maybe has a little bit less holes long-term than the Devils. When you look at the forward group, that top six, of course, is absolutely nasty, and there's not really a shortage of guys coming up. A lot of guys for the Bevel Sens that will be on the roster and on that bottom six in no time, and you got, of course, Shane Pinto, who's probably going to have a great Calder campaign this next year. But the defense is obviously the biggest concern, but you still have players like Shabbat there, Artem Zub, who will be in their primes over these next 5 years, and to me, I mean, like with Jake Sanderson coming up, with players like Lassie Thompson coming up, it will be okay. I don't think it's going to be a strength necessarily, but I think once the youth truly comes on the roster, they'll be good enough. And the goaltending, I think, is pretty solid with Anton Forsberg, to me, being a pretty underrated guy, but also the Sens do have a lot in the system that could replace them if they need to, with players like Matt Zugard as well, highlighting that. But to me, the talent and the depth on the roster is really what shines. But next up, let's keep on the Atlantic Division, going on to number 9, a team that absolutely by 2027 will not be a playoff team, but I think over these next 3 years will still be one of the better teams in the NHL. Next up, I have the Tampa Bay Lightning, and you could have them much lower, and I could see why you would, but to me, I just look at that roster and I still see a really competitive team, and a team that deservedly so has gone to the Stanley Cup Final 3 straight years in a row. And with Nikita Kucherov, Brayden Point still being below 30 years old, it's absolutely insane to think about that. But you got players like Nick Paul locked up long term for them, Brandon Hagel, who's going to be huge, hopefully coming into the roster, and Ross Colton, who's only 26 years old. You look at that defense, and Victor Hedman, it feels like he's way older, but is only 31 years old. Sergachev is 24, Chernak is 25, Cal Foote will be hopefully coming into his own, and Andre Vasilevsky, after winning 2 Stanley Cups, is 28, and he's locked up long term, and to me, he'll continue to be one of the best goaltenders in the entire NHL, and continue to be the brand of consistency that the Bolts need, on top of Anthony Chiarelli also being 25 years old still, and I think the Lightning will still be able to be a menace over these next couple of seasons. But now let's keep up with the Atlantic Division, going on to another team here, and just slightly above Tampa Bay, I'm going to go with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, here's the thing, on paper, I think the Leafs have one of the better rosters for these next 5 years, but there's also still the Leafs factor, where they're the Toronto Maple Leafs, and if we're judging success over the next 5 years, betting on the Toronto Maple Leafs to have success isn't really a success, it's not a recipe for success, if you get what I'm saying here. But Still, you look at the roster, and even though there are going to be some question marks with Austin Matthews wanting a raise, with potentially William Nylander wanting a raise, I still think over these next 3-4 seasons, they'll still be one of the better teams in the NHL, and it also, again, goes back to the youth they have coming up with Matthew Nyes, Nicholas Robertson on that forward group coming up, on that defense, Rasmus Sandin, and Timothy Liljegren being so young, and to me, I think they'll be good enough. Maybe not amazing, maybe not the best team in the NHL, but still one of the better ones over these next 5 years. Now, funnily enough, let's go on to the 4th straight Atlantic Division team, and I guess you could tell the Atlantic's still going to be pretty good over these next few seasons. But next up, I have a team that, for me personally, might be number 1 if we're talking the next 10 years, but over the next 5 years, they'll still be extremely fun to watch, and I got Steve Yzerman's Detroit Red Wings. Again, a team that over the next 10 years, I think is going to be dominant, but over the next 5 years, I still think will be very great. You look at the roster with players like Dylan Larkin, and most of that core being below 30 years old, and most of the great core there as well, with players like Moritz Seider, Lucas Raymond, and all the youth they have coming up, of course, being as young as they are. I do still have question marks with that goaltending, and there is still huge question marks for that defense, but once players like Simone Edmondson come up, once players like William Wallander come up for the Red Wings, I think that defense will be fixed over time, and I think the Red Wings will eventually be one of the better teams, and especially by 2025, will be one of the best teams out there. Next up, though, let's move on to number 6, and let's go on to Connor McDavid's Edmonton Oilers, a team that I am really interested to see how they really turn the page over these next 5 years. You, of course, had this last year where they finally had some great playoff success and were able to truly get past that barrier going on to the Western Conference Final. But to me, when it comes to the Oilers, these next couple years specifically are going to be huge for them. But you look over the roster, and they're decently set over these next 5 seasons. You got McDavid locked up for 4, Draisaitl locked up for 3, and a lot of players like Kane and Nugent Hopkins being locked up for a long time, as well in that defense with players like Nurse and, of course, Bouchard and Broberg coming up, to name a couple, and Jack Campbell signed for the next 5 seasons. And as long as Connor McDavid is Connor McDavid and that Oilers roster is able to be concise around him, I think they'll be just fine and will likely be, especially over these next 3 seasons, one of the biggest playoff contenders. But now we enter the top 5, and to me, we go on to another Pacific team that I think just barely edges out Edmonton to potentially maybe being better in 2026, 2027. And next up, I have the Los Angeles Kings, a team that is obviously carried by a lot of its youthful talents, but I think that's kind of where it makes or breaks for me personally, because you look at the cap situation. I mean, Anze Kopitar being 35 years old is crazy to think about, and of course you got Drew Doughty, who's 32 years old himself, but I think it really depends, and to me, I think it kind of depends on 2 guys, with Quinton Byfield and, of course, Brant Clark. You have potential replacements of Anze Kopitar and Drew Doughty there, and if they're able to even get close to those levels, if they're able to be a first-line center and number 1 defenseman, to me, I think that really will carry over LA success. But you've got a great core there already of established NHL talent and upcoming talent, and to me, especially if they're able to get that goaltending a little bit more consistent, I feel like LA will be one of the better teams out there, but also that goaltending is a concern. Will Cal Peterson be able to succeed Jonathan Quick after all? That will be a big question mark for them. Next up at number 4, a team that in my opinion is almost carried by their youthful talents, really paving the way over these next 5 seasons. To me, at number 4, I'm going to go with the Carolina Hurricanes, a team that, in my opinion, won't just have a great chance to win the Cup, get far in 2023, but by the time 2027 rolls around, will still be in a great position. And that's mostly because of the youth of their core, with Sebastian Aho being 25, Svechkov being 22, Teravainen being 28, but you got Kotkaniemi, Natchez, Seth Jarvis, and the way that prospect pool is constructed, there's going to be so much depth on every single position. But you look at the defense, Slavin is still 28, Shea's still 28, Pesci's 27, and you got, of course, younger guys like Bear coming on that roster too. And the goaltending, although is a little bit of a long-term issue right now, I still think Pyotr Kochetkov will be good enough to succeed Anderson when he needs to and will be in that starting role. And again, considering how spread that prospect pool is, the depth will be coming in droves every single season. Next up, let's go on to the top 3, and a team that I was kind of surprised was this high, but the more I think about it, the more I think they'll be one of the more consistently elite teams over these next 5 years. And it is weird to say, but at number 3, I have the Calgary Flames. I know. It's weird to think about, but I genuinely think the Flames will be one of the better teams over this next half decade, and it's the way the roster is constructed. Even though you have some older players, per se, in players like Kadri, in players like Tanev, and players like Markstrom, to me, there is always going to be a good replacement for them. But you look at the ages, Huberdeau at 29, Mangiapane at 26, players like Lindholm at 27, and at defense, Hannafin's 25, Anderson's 25, you got Uyghur at 28, you got Valimaki and Shillington, who are 25 and below. And to me, I think the biggest reason why the Flames will continue to be great is that prospect pool. You got players like Pellichet and Matt Coronado coming up in the forward group. That defense still has some guys left behind, but also the goaltending. Once Jacob Markstrom possibly decides to slide around 2025, Dustin Wolf will be knocking on the door and will be one of the better younger goalies in the entire NHL, and to me, that's really what sets the Flames apart. But now let's go on to the top two, and to me, these two teams are locked as the best futures, especially over these next 5 years in the NHL. But now let's move on to number two, and let's go on to the New York Rangers, a team that I think is in a prime position to truly contend, and taking that next step to the Eastern Conference Final this last year was so pivotal in so many ways. And even though some players lean on the older side, even the players that do lean on the older side, I think will age pretty gracefully. Players like Artemi Panarin, who aren't too physical, are going to be fine in my opinion. And you look at that defense, Adam Fox is 24, Lindgren is 24, you got players like Miller and Schneider coming up, and of course you got the forward group of got players like Hedel and Kakko and Lafreniere, and of course Offman coming up eventually, and of course Igor Shesterkin being 26 years old, right entering the prime of his career, and will likely be the best goaltender in the NHL over these next 5 seasons. And to me, I think the Rangers have one of the better chances of anybody of maybe even winning multiple cups over these next 5 seasons, if they're able to continue to improve and continue to improve in the playoffs. But now let's move on to number one, and I'll say there isn't much of a difference between the Rangers and this number one pick, but to me, especially with how this last season went and how interesting the cap situation is for them for the future, at number one, I am gonna go with the Colorado Avalanche, a team that, in my opinion, has the best chance to win a cup in these next 5 years, win multiple cups over these next 5 years, and it all goes back to that core of Nathan MacKinnon, Landeskog, Rantanen, Cale Makar, who's 23 years old, which is crazy to think about. But you have it also kind of is like a Flame situation, where you have a lot of guys coming up that could replace different players. For the Avs, they'll have Alex Newhook coming into the roster, Bowen Byram's going to be huge in that defense, Justus Annunen could be huge in the goaltending side of things if they really need him to, but I think that depth is going to be huge for them, and locking up the right guys too, like Valeri Nichushkin, like Arturi Lehkonen, who are both 27 respectively. And to me, I think the Avs, especially with their cap situation, are one of the better teams out there, one of the better managed teams out there, and I think that will continue to provide great wins in great moments over the next half decade. But that will be it for today, guys. Let me know in the comments down below, what did you agree and disagree with, and let me know where your team should be in this ranking. Do you think they should have a better, do they have a better future? Do they have a worse future? Let me know your thoughts down below. Of course, share this video with your friends, get it to all the hockey fans you guys know online. Click this card for all my hockey rankings content and binge some more videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.